All right, welcome back. We are continuing our look at the 8th century writing prophets. With this presentation, we are moving down now to the south and taking a look at Isaiah of Jerusalem. The book of Isaiah, as it's presented in your Bible, is usually seen to consist of three different sections, probably written at three different periods of time. First of all, we're going to have the main book of Isaiah, uh, based on the prophet that lived in Jerusalem in the 8th century, and that will extend from chapters 1 through 39. And then usually chapter 40 to 55 is called Second Isaiah. We'll see a little bit later that that part of the book was probably an addition added to update Isaiah for the time of the exile. And then finally, Third Isaiah is chapters 56 through 66, and that was probably written after some of the exiles had returned and were dealing with some of the issues of living their own life together. So in this presentation, we're going to focus just on First Isaiah, in other words, chapters 1 to 39, and probably spend most of our time actually on the first 12 chapters. Let's take a look briefly at some of the historical background. We have talked about most of this in relationship to Amos and Hosea, and so Isaiah was living during those same turbulent times, and so I think you're fairly well familiar with these already. We have talked about Assyria's return to power under King Tiglath-Pileser, beginning in 745. He is going to conquer Babylon, Urartu, annex Phoenicia to his kingdom, take tribute from Menachem, and then finally from King Ahaz of Judah, and we're going to see the fall of Damascus in 732. And so during this whole time period, as Isaiah is coming closer, he, of course, is threatening the northern kingdom, but he's also getting close to the southern kingdom as well, and that is causing some of the same fear there. Shalmaneser is going to succeed him, and the north is probably going to fall under King Shalmaneser. The time of King Sargon is going to be a time of continued battle and uncertainty. Sargon is going to do war in Babylonia, also up in northern Syria. He's going to take tribute from Judah as well. And then finally, King Sennacherib is also going to attempt to attack Judah and take over the southern kingdom. In terms of an outline of Isaiah 1 to 39, it's fairly complex, so let me just summarize some of the major blocks of material for you. In chapters 1 through 12, we're going to contain the initial oracles about Israel and Judah. Then in chapter 13, we're going to turn to oracles against the nations. We talked about oracles against the nations in Amos at the beginning of Amos, and I think they have some of the same purposes here in Isaiah that they did there. Chapters 24 to 27 are going to be a section of apocalyptic material, often called the Little Apocalypse. We're going to have further oracles about, or should we say by Isaiah, about Israel might be a more accurate way to put it, in 28 to 33. From chapters 34 to 35, we seem to have some material from the 6th century part of Isaiah 40 to 55 from Deutero-Isaiah or Second Isaiah seems to have found its way into First Isaiah. And then finally in chapters 36 to 39, we're going to have some historical material that is pretty much copied directly from 2 Kings about the reign of King Hezekiah. Let's jump now into the material itself, and we're going to start today by taking a look at Isaiah chapters 1 through 6. This part of the book is going to be from fairly early on in Isaiah's ministry, perhaps in the first few years, and we're going to see that he's going to offer some of the same criticisms that Amos had leveled against the north. Just like in the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom here as well had benefited greatly from the relative time of peace and prosperity during the first half of the 8th century when the Assyrians were not as actively pursuing their westward campaigns. And so some of the same problems that developed from that peace and prosperity and wealth in the northern kingdom also seem to have showed itself in the south. For instance, in Isaiah chapter 1, beginning with verse 21, he's going to say how the faithful city has become a war. She that was full of justice, righteousness lodged in her, but now murderers. Your silver has become dross, your wine is mixed with water, your princes are rebels, your companions of thieves. Everyone loves a bribe and runs after gifts. They do not defend the orphan, and the widow's cause does not come before them. So once again, they are taking advantage of the poor. They are neglecting them, probably for their own benefit, and Isaiah is going to criticize them for that harshly. In Isaiah 5, verses 8 and 9, we're going to have some more references along those same lines. Ah, you who join house to house, who add field to field until there is room for no one but you, and you are left to live alone in the midst of the land. Many scholars have suggested that this is a perfect example of what's taking place as the wealthy people begin to build up very large estates with the land that they have found a way to take away from the poor, perhaps on the basis of very strict interpretation of laws of foreclosure. However, God is not going to stand for this, and so in verse 9, we read that the Lord of hosts has sworn in my hearing, surely many houses shall be desolate, large and beautiful houses without inhabitant. In other words, the punishment is going to fit the crime. You have built these grand and wonderful houses and estates, but you are not going to live in them or enjoy them. Furthermore, your farmland will no longer produce. 10 acres of vineyard shall yield but one bath, and a homer of seed shall yield a mere ephah. So we can see that God is going to predict the same kind of destruction in retaliation for their sins against the poor that Amos had suggested up in the northern kingdom. Chapters 18 or verses 18 rather and following of chapter 5 are going to say some of the same kinds of things. Verse 20, ah, you who call evil good and good evil, and put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. In verse 22, you who are heroes in drinking wine and valiant in mixing drinks, who acquit the guilty for a bribe and deprive the innocent of their rights. So again, bribery of the judge in order to find against the poor was another way in which they were taking advantage of one another, rather than treating others as brothers and sisters created in the image of God. Again, like Amos, Isaiah is also going to tell the people that their worship, their upholding of religious festivals and celebrations is not enough to cover for the actions they are taking. So in chapter 1, beginning with verse 12, for instance, Yahweh asks, when you come to appear before me, who asked this from your hand? Trample my courts no more. Bringing offerings is futile. Incense is an abomination to me. New moon and Sabbath and calling of convocation, I cannot endure solemn assemblies with iniquity. God hates the worship that is offered by people who are doing it just so they can go back out and continue their bad behavior. Your new moon and your appointed festivals my soul hates. They have become a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them. In verse 16, he says, wash yourselves, make yourselves clean, remove the evil of your doing from before my eyes, cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. It is not sacrifice and offering and keeping of festivals that God wants, but it is the people treating one another fairly instead of taking advantage of one another that God really demands. However, God does allow for the possibility of redemption. In chapter 1, verses 18 to 20, he says, come now, let us argue it out. Though your sins are like scarlet, they shall be like snow. Though they are red like crimson, they shall become like wool. If you are willing and obedient, you shall eat the good of the land. But if you refuse and rebel, you shall be devoured by the sword, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. Finally, after Isaiah contains all of these criticisms of the prophet, of what the people are doing, we're going to get the story of Isaiah's call narrative, so to speak, in chapter 6. It's often been noted that it's rather strange that the call narrative of a prophet does not come at the beginning of the book, as we are going to see when we get to Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and so forth. It will usually stand in chapter 1. Some people have suggested different reasons for this. Some have suggested maybe that Isaiah's call narrative is going to be moved later on. Some people are going to suggest that this call narrative of chapter 6, however, did not occur right at the very beginning of Isaiah's ministry, but it was kind of a renewal of his call after some of the things that he said in chapter 1 through 5 were not heard. In other words, Isaiah might have spoken the oracles of chapters 1 through 5 at first, and then after that had his call experience in the temple. That's kind of the explanation I tend to go towards. So let's turn to chapter 6 and let's take a look at what we see in this fairly well-known chapter. There are essentially two kinds of call narratives in the Old Testament. There is the kind that is experienced by Moses and Jeremiah, for instance, where it is just one person all of a sudden having a vision of God or hearing from God, an audition from God, telling him to go out and preach to God's people. The second kind of call narrative that we have in the Old Testament is the kind that occurs in the divine council. In 1 Kings 22, for instance, we're going to have a prophet there describing his experiences in the divine council where he witnessed the deliberations of God and God's advisors, his angels or what have you, and this is the source of his call. That also seems to be the situation in Isaiah. Let's begin at the beginning of chapter 6. He's going to say, in the year that King Uzziah died, which was about 642, if I remember correctly, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne high and lofty, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. So notice he sees Yahweh, he sees God sitting on a throne, but God's not entirely contained within the temple. The hem of God's robe fills the temple. That means it is God's feet that are in the temple, but God's throne itself is in heaven. It calls to mind the verse where the psalmist refers to the earth as God's footstool. And so as God is sitting on his throne and as Isaiah is having this vision, he sees seraphs in attendance about him, each with 6 wings. 2 cover their faces because they are in the glorious presence of God. 2 covered their feet, which is a euphemism for the genitals because they do not want God to see their nakedness. And with 2 they fly. They are saying this song, holy, 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 proclaiming God's holiness, which the scholar Brevard Childs defines as, quote, the essence of God's nature. In other words, God is completely removed from the profane, completely removed from the common, from the everyday, and that's what it means to refer to God as holy. So what's probably going on here is we have a vision of the divine council, Isaiah watching Yahweh preside over the divine council, and he goes on in verse 5 to confess his sin. I said, woe is me, for I am a man of unclean lips. I am lost, I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, yet my eyes have seen the Lord of hosts. You might remember from Exodus 33 the danger of seeing God. However, that is not going to stop Isaiah from fulfilling his call. Indeed, God is going to make his call possible for him by taking a pair of tongs, touching his lips, and purifying him so that once again he can be in the presence of God. What is also curious here in chapter 6 is what God then says to Isaiah beginning in verse 9. Where he tells Isaiah to say to the people, keep listening but do not comprehend, keep looking but do not understand. Make the mind of this people dull and stop their ears and shut their eyes, so they may not look with their eyes and listen with their ears and comprehend with their minds and turn and be healed. It seems kind of strange to us that God would call Isaiah to be a prophet and then promise Isaiah that in his speaking he is going to close the ears of the people so they are not going to hear what he says and thus repent. Isaiah is going to cry out in verse 11, "How long, O Lord?" And God will respond, "Until cities lie waste without inhabitant, and houses without people, and the land is utterly desolate, until the Lord sends everyone far away, and vast is the emptiness in the midst of the land. Even if a tenth part remain in it, it will be burned again, like a terebinth or an oak whose stump remains standing when it is felled. The holy seed is its stump." It's not unusual for prophets to be promised that their activity that they're speaking on behalf of God is going to be ineffective, to say the least. And this is essentially what Isaiah has been promised. Some people have suggested that Isaiah chapter 5 already portends the fact that there's going to be destruction, that it predicts destruction, and perhaps chapter 6 is intended to say why that is, because the people's hearts are hardened by the prophecy. The scholar Klaus Koch has suggested that these verses express Isaiah's frustration when his criticisms, his social criticisms in chapters 1 through 5 were not heard. And so, as part of his frustration with that, he simply tells the people that part of their punishment for their social misbehavior is going to be that their hearts will be hardened so much that they will not hear and listen to the words that could save them. People have had similar questions, for instance, about God hardening Pharaoh's heart back in Exodus, where once again the most common interpretation is that God's hardening of Pharaoh's heart was a punishment for Pharaoh's treatment of the Israelites. As a result of that, his heart was hardened so that he would not be saved, but would suffer the punishment for his actions. In any case, this is the call story of Isaiah, a story in which he is promised not immediate success, not that he's going to turn the nation around, but promised that people in many cases are going to be resistant to what he has to say. The next part of Isaiah I'd like to look at is going to be chapter 7 and 8, where we have something that is usually called the Syro-Ephraimite crisis. This story begins at the beginning of chapter 7, when it tells us that during the kingship of Ahaz, so probably around 734 is when this starts, King Radzin of Aram and King Pekah, son of Remaliah of Israel, went up to Jerusalem, but could not mount an attack against it. What seems to be going on here is that Radzin, the king of Syria, which is sometimes also called Aram, and Pekah, the king of the northern kingdom of Israel, are, of course, scared to death of the approaching Assyrians that we've been talking about, and so they form an alliance in an attempt to fend off the Assyrian threat. They decide that there's nothing they would like more than to get a third member to join their coalition, which of course would be Ahaz, king of Judah. However, Ahaz at first refuses. He is hesitant to join this coalition, so what happens is that Radzin and Pekah attack Jerusalem in an effort to force Judah to join this coalition against Assyria. Isaiah is going to get pulled into this crisis very quickly. In verse 2, it's going to tell us how scared they all are when the house of David heard that Aram had allied itself with Ephraim. The heart of Ahaz and the heart of the people shook as the trees of the forest shake before the wind. And so in order to help him get over his fear and to give him some reassurance, Isaiah is going to go out and he is going to give some advice to Ahaz about how to handle this situation. So in chapter 7, verse 3, the Lord will say to Ahaz, go out to Isaiah rather, go out to meet Ahaz, you and your son Shear-Yashuv, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool on the highway to the fuller's field. So in other words, take your son Shear-Yashuv, which means a remnant shall remain, Shear-Yashuv, and go out to this certain spot in the country and meet King Ahaz. And in verse 4, it tells the advice that Isaiah is supposed to give to the king. Now, as Isaiah is going out to talk to Ahaz, it seems that Ahaz essentially has three options. One would be to give in and join the coalition against Assyria. The second option would be to call on Assyria for help, to call Assyria and say, come and help me because Rezin and Pekah are attacking me. That would have the advantage of being safe, probably, but it would also essentially make Judah a vassal of Assyria. Siding with the coalition against Assyria, on the other hand, would get Rezin and Pekah away from Jerusalem and stop the immediate attack on his capital. However, it would also put him on the wrong side of Assyria, which he knows is far more powerful than these other nations. So, King Ahaz is scared to death. He knows that he's in a lose-lose situation and he doesn't know what to do. And so here is how Isaiah tells him to handle that situation in verse 4. Take heed, be quiet, do not fear, and do not let your heart be faint because of these two smoldering stumps of firebrands, because of the fierce anger of Rezin and Aram and the son of Remaliah. In other words, God is saying, don't be scared. And for heaven's sake, don't side with the coalition and don't call on Assyria for help. Just be Switzerland. Stay neutral because eventually God is going to take care of this situation for you. In verse 5, because Aram with Ephraim and the son of Remaliah has plotted against you evil, saying, let us go up against Judah and cut off Jerusalem and conquer it for ourselves and make the son of Tabeel king. And therefore, thus says the Lord. And so here's the divine promise in verses 7 and 8. It shall not stand and it shall not come to pass. In other words, Syria and Israel will not be able to conquer you. For the head of Aram is Damascus and the head of Damascus is Rezin. And then let's go down to the last sentence of verse 9. If you do not stand firm in faith, you shall not stand at all. And so again, the promise that the problem that the king is facing is that Syria and Israel are attacking Jerusalem in an attempt to get them to join a coalition against Syria. The way to stop the immediate attack on Jerusalem would be to join the coalition. However, that would put a target on his back for Assyria. The other option is to call to Assyria, but that would be very expensive, and it would also make him a subject of the Assyrian Empire, or answerable to the Assyrian Empire. Isaiah is going to say, stay still. It's going to continue beginning in verse 10, where we're going to get the second child of Isaiah, who has a symbolic name, and that is going to be the child named Emmanuel. Okay, so we have already had Sha'ar Yeshuv, which means a remnant shall return. Here we're going to have Emmanuel, which means God is with us. And in chapter 7, beginning with verse 14, it's going to explain that by the time this child is born, Jerusalem and grows up enough to learn the difference between right and wrong. So in other words, by the time this child is born and grows up a little bit to become a very young child, this danger is going to be over and God will have already taken care of Syria and Israel for them. Once again, the message is just to sit tight. And of course, the symbolic name gives them the promise for why they can sit tight and trust in God, because God is with them. Finally, beginning in verse 18, we're going to have a little fuller explanation of exactly what God intends to do. On that day, the Lord will whistle for the fly that is at the sources of the streams of Egypt, and for the bee that is in the land of Assyria. And they will all come and settle in the steep ravines and in the clefts of the rock and on all the thorn bushes and in all the pastures. In other words, these foreign nations, the Assyrians are going to come and are going to fill the valleys like a swarm of insects, and they are going to attack Rezin and Pekah, which will lead to security for Jerusalem once again. In other words, why pay the Assyrians? Why give them a whole lot of money and become their vassals if Assyria is already going to conquer Raitzen and Pekah anyway? Why pay for what eventually you're going to get for free? 2 Kings 16 is going to tell us which of those three options available to Ahaz he followed. Did he side with the coalition? Did he call on Assyria for help? Or did he trust God and remain neutral? Of course, this being the Old Testament and us knowing what most Old Testament characters are like, we can guess that he did not remain faithful, and we would be right. Chapter 16 of 2 Kings, beginning with verse 5, tells the story that these two kings came up to wage war on Jerusalem. They besieged Ahaz but could not conquer them. And then verse 6, it tells about some involvement of Edom taking some more land. And then finally in verse 7, it tells us that Ahaz sent messengers to King Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria, saying, I am your servant and your son. Come and rescue me from the hand of the king of Aram and from the hand of the king of Israel who are attacking me. Ahaz also took the silver and the gold found in the house of the Lord and in the treasures of the king's house and sent a present to the king of Assyria. The king of Assyria listened to him. The king of Assyria marched up against Damascus and took it, carrying its people captive to Kir, and he killed Raitzen. So in 732, we're going to have the fall of Damascus, and that is brought about here. Unfortunately, Ahaz has now made himself beholden to Assyria against the advice of Ahaz, and that's how this crisis is going to come to an end. Okay, next let's take a look at chapter 2, and I want to look at an example of something that is common throughout Isaiah and also in some of the Psalms called Zion theology. We're going to have several passages which celebrate God's selection of Mount Zion as his place of dwelling and the place to put his temple there. In chapter 2, for instance, it kind of gives a picture of the glorious future of Mount Zion. In chapter 2, verse 2, in the days to come, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established as the highest of the mountains and shall be raised above the hills, and all the people shall stream to it. Okay, so Mount Zion is going to be raised up high and everybody is going to come there. Many people shall come and say, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth instruction and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So again, in the midst of perhaps a time of great struggle and great difficulty in the nation, Isaiah is going to come and talk about the future of Mount Zion as being glorious, not being a future of destruction or defeat. Verse 4, he shall judge between the nations and shall arbitrate for many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. As it is found in Isaiah and some of the Psalms, the Zion theology, as identified by Professor Roberts at Princeton Seminary, contains several key elements. The first theme is the idea that God is the great king. And so this hill is going to be lifted up and God is going to be the great king in Zion. For another reference to God as the great king, let's look briefly at Psalm chapter 48, verse 2. Psalm 48 is one of those Zion psalms, and you're going to see that it starts out with some similar themes to what we were just reading in Isaiah 2. Great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised in the city of our God, his holy mountain, beautiful in elevation, is the joy of all the earth. So we have this reference to a high mountain. Mount Zion in the far north, notice the city of the great king. So God is the king who has chosen Zion for his dwelling place. Chapter 6, verse 5, as part of this call narrative, also is going to draw on this tradition of Yahweh being portrayed as a king. Now, not only is Yahweh the great king in Zion theology, but God has also chosen Jerusalem for his dwelling place. Let's look at a few of the Psalms that make mention of that. For example, in Psalm 78, beginning with verse 67, it will start by indicating he rejected the tent of Joseph. He did not choose the tribe of Ephraim. So in other words, the psalmist here is saying that God intentionally chose Judah as his home, not the northern kingdom. But he chose the tribe of Judah, Mount Zion, which he loved. He built his sanctuary like the high heavens, like the earth, which he has founded forever. And then notice what's going to go along with that in verse 70. He chose his servant David and took him from the sheepfolds. And so the idea of Zion and David are going to go together here. In Psalm 132, verses 13 and 14, we're going to see further references to Jerusalem as God's dwelling place. For the Lord has chosen Zion, he has desired it for his habitation. This is my resting place forever. Here I will reside, for I have desired it. And again, he's going to make reference to David down in verse 17, preparing a lamb for his anointed one. Now, Professor Roberts says there are three main implications that come from God's choosing of Jerusalem for his dwelling place. First of all, he says it has implications for Zion's topography. We have seen some of the descriptions of Zion as a high mountain that will be lifted up above all other mountains and above all other nations. In addition, there is usually some kind of a peaceful river or water associated with Zion. So, for example, let's look at Psalm 46. There are a few key items in Psalm 46, and the first one is in verse 4. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. So once again, God has chosen Jerusalem for his dwelling place. It has implications for Zion's topography. It is a high mountain, and it has these freshly flowing, peaceful streams. In addition, there are going to be implications for Zion's security. God is going to keep Zion from being changed or from being damaged. That mountain is going to be safe. Psalm 46, verse 2. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth should change, though the mountains shake in the heart of the sea. In other words, all of the chaos of the surrounding world is not going to be able to be a threat to Zion. In verse 5 of Psalm 26, God is in the midst of the city. Again, God dwells there, and it shall not be moved. God will help it when the morning dawns. The nations are in an uproar, the kingdoms totter. He utters his voice, the earth melts. The Lord of hosts is Jacob. The Lord of hosts is with us, rather, and the God of Jacob is our refuge. And then down in verses 8 and 9 of Psalm 46, we're going to see again some of the references to the same kind of that we were introduced to in Isaiah 2. Come, behold the works of the Lord. See what desolations he has brought on the earth. But then in verse 9, he makes wars cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow. He shatters the spear. He burns the shields with fire. And so the implication is that Zion is going to be secure, and the implication for Zion's inhabitants, of course, is going to be that they will be safe in this city as well. Now, it's also often said that Isaiah was probably drawing on some ancient Canaanite traditions in writing some of these things, and that the Zion theology probably emerges from some ancient Canaanite traditions. Perhaps especially around the city of Ugarit, Ugarit, which is going to be quite a ways up to the north, also on the shore of the Mediterranean Sea. A lot of the tablets found at Ugarit also contain references to the god living on a high mountain. And so we know that that motif of a god living on a high mountain was common in Israel, and it was perhaps drawn upon in describing Jerusalem as God's city, especially since Jerusalem is not really on a real high hill, as it seems to suggest, but more or less on a slope. Back to Isaiah 2 now. Let's refer once again to some of the things that Isaiah says here and relate them to Zion theology. We have the height of Zion, we have the safety and security of Zion, and we have the peace that comes with God arbitrating between the nations, so they beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. The scholar Brevard Childs likes to compare what we see here in verses 1 through 4 of Isaiah 2 with the rest of the chapter, which seems to be written by way of contrast with Isaiah 2, perhaps to emphasize some of the things of verses 1 to 4 a little bit more. For example, in verse 2, the mountain containing God's house is exalted as the highest one of all, whereas in verses 12 and following, the high mountains and lofty hills and proud towers are not built by God, but are symbols of human arrogance. In the first unit, in verses 1 to 4, the nations flow to the mountain to learn about God. In the second part of the chapter, the land is filled with foreigners, traders, and soothsayers. In the first passage, verses 1 to 4, the nations reject. The nations come to walk in God's path, rather, and in the second part, they worship their own inventions. In the first section, the nations reject weapons of violence, and in the second, there is a tremendous number of horses and chariots. There is peace and harmony of God's reign in the first section of the passage, and in the rest, there is what Childs calls terror, fear, and humiliation. Finally, of course, Zion theology is generally going to have a close relationship to the concept of the Davidic kingship and the idea of God choosing David for an eternal king. I would encourage you to look at Isaiah chapters 9 and 11 for that. Chapter 9, as you will find out, may have been a composition on the date of Hezekiah's ascendance to the throne in 715, and the hopes that were expressed that he would relieve the people from all of the chaos of the surrounding battles with the Assyrians. And then in chapter 11, we're also going to have another reference to Davidic kingship. Chapter 11, some people have suggested, may come from after the exile. Some people think that the reference to the stump of Jesse makes this post-exilic, but that passage has generally been seen as very difficult to date. I'm not going to say any more about this because this is going to be your opportunity to tell me how you would interpret these passages, or at least Isaiah 9, because that is going to be the topic for the paper that you are working on right now. Okay, and then finally, let me say just a little bit more about Hezekiah. You'll remember again, we said that during this entire period, the Assyrian Empire is making a lot of incursions into the land. They had already defeated the northern kingdom in 722, but in the following years, they continued to push farther and farther south. They have probably, by the end of the 8th century, they have probably destroyed a lot of the villages in the countryside, even in Judah. And in about 701, they are going to surround Jerusalem. One inscription from Assyria, the king brags that he has locked up Hezekiah in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. Isaiah 36 to 39 will indicate that for whatever reason, the Assyrians did not finally take Jerusalem after surrounding it. They then left, perhaps because they heard about another battle that they needed to fight, perhaps because there was some mass illness that affected the troops. Historians have debated about that significantly, but of course Isaiah and 2 Kings are going to show how God used this event to save the people of Jerusalem from the onslaught of Assyria so that they could live over another century longer. More information about that would be available in your textbooks. Okay, we're not going to get to the rest of Isaiah. These are the parts that I wanted to focus on now. I hope that you have enjoyed our comments, our discussions of these 8th century prophets, Amos and Hosea in the north, and Isaiah here in the south. And also be thinking again in terms of Mount Sinai versus Mount Zion, the tale of two mountains. Remember, we said Hosea probably came from the Sinai tradition, talks a lot about the covenant of obedience and loyalty to God. You've probably figured out by now that Isaiah tends to come from the Zion tradition, the idea that God is going to give security to Zion and security to the Davidic kingship within it. Thanks for joining me. Come back for the next module where we will cover the rest of Israel's history down to the exile and the role of Jeremiah